I like to start in the 1940s when John Nash was at a bar with friends and he realized that their pickup strategy was all wrong. And most men at that point probably would have changed pickup lines or switched to buying drinks. But Nash went out and created a mathematical theory of non cooperative games and explained why we make decisions that are not in our best interest. To each his own, I guess. And I really don't have any information on how well this works when courting the opposite sex in bars, nor do I, frankly, have any good personal experience to share. But we will talk about how this theory keeps our country or the US in a political prisoner's dilemma. And then we talk about we also explore the folly of the Democrats who insist on enforced infighting and playing by the rules set by the opposition. Democratic leadership apparently sees Democrats as weak, woke, and in need of both clever alliterations and uncomfortable vulgarity, though one does Democratic. Hey there, welcome to Masters of Influence. I'm Jeff Lair. And I'd like to start in the 1940s with John Nash, who was at a bar with friends when he realized that their strategy for approaching women was all wrong. Now, most men would have changed pickup lines or switched to buying drinks. Nash went out and created a mathematical theory of non cooperative games and explained why we make decisions that are not in our best interest. To each his own, I guess. And while I can't find any information about how well this works when courting the opposite sex in bars, nor do I frankly have any personal experience to relate, we can talk about how this theory keeps the US in a political prisoner's dilemma and forces us to continue to have the kinds of conversations that we continue to have. Along those lines, we'll talk about the Democrats' insistence on enforced infighting and playing by the rules of the opposition. Apparently, Democratic leadership sees Democrats as weak, woke, and in need of both clever alliterations and uncomfortable vulgarity. And then we also cover first quarter economic results, which were actually interesting despite being called economic results, and talk about how they suggest a significant power shift even as those taking the reins and claiming the power shift insist on blaming others for those interesting economic results. So, anyway, stick around, subscribe, leave some comments and snide remarks, and let's go into the show.
Power moves in the shadows and out in the open. Do you see it? Hosted by Jeff Lair, Masters of Influence uncovers the tactics of persuasion, control, and decision-making that shape history, business, and everyday life. Through stories, interviews, and expert insights, we pull back the curtain on the forces shaping our world. Let's decode power together.
One of the first things that we looked at with Robert Greene was this idea of consistency in your messaging and clarity in your messaging and controlling the conversation and your brand. Some actions that the Democrats are taking are really interesting in that context because it's something that they clearly are not getting.
Yeah.
And we talked earlier about this Department of Education
Yeah.
thing. We talked about how they went to the Department of Education and whined at the door. Yeah. Yeah. Let me in. Let me in, please. I'm important. The problem with that, and we talked about that within the context of their brand, but also within the context of disdaining the things that you can't
Yes.
have and trying to set yourself apart from the other side, not letting them control the narrative. And I thought it was really interesting. I really have to get good at pronouncing people's names before I try to say them because I read all these things and I say their name in my brain, but that
but then
doesn't
that's not what comes
necessarily
out of your
have
mouth.
anything to do. No, it is what comes out of
Oh,
my
okay.
mouth. That just has nothing to do with how they may pronounce their names. So if I get somebody's name wrong, I apologize. That's not actually the point. I thought was interesting was Senator Slotkin gave a speech, and if you remember, she gave the uh, response
Oh
to
yeah, yeah,
the
yeah,
State
yeah,
of the
yeah,
Union
yeah, yeah.
address, and gave sort of a nice, concise response that it was okay. But it was nice and concise, laid out some positions, and then she got on, she got off, and it was done. And it was good from that perspective. But now she's got this whole thing where she's talking about how we have to have more alpha energy and we have to take back the fucking flag because adding a swear word in there is going to make us so much more powerful, right? And then she goes on about how we can't be weak and woke anymore. And I look at that and I'm like, what exactly are you trying to say?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what woke is, by the way. I don't know. Nobody seems to be able to define this. Do you know what woke is?
Well, I'll give you my understanding. Okay. Woke is when you've gone too far left, right? That you're starting to like. Now I'll tell you how how you know it's like oh, you've got my pronoun wrong, but I just met you. Like I just
Yeah.
met you.
So
I
that's
didn't even know
that's
you
woke
had a
when
pronoun. Thanks for setting me
yeah.
straight, but how would I know that you had a pronoun before I even opened my mouth and before we met? Like I'm not clairvoyant.
Yeah.
And that's woke. Like that whole narrative of being in a world where you
So it's
have to
it's like
know.
another way of
Yeah.
saying political
Yes,
correctness,
but like
really. It's sort of the
ultra, it's
new
like
way to say political correctness.
hyper political correctness. Like beyond just
Because I
because with political correctness, at least I have an opportunity to be wrong first, and then you can correct me, and then I have to be politically correct after you correct me. But in woke, I have to be correct before I know.
So good. So we'll take that as one definition of being
Yeah.
woke. What it seems to me to be is basically whatever the conservatives don't like is called
Oh
woke.
yeah.
So, but to come back to this idea, I we started this with the idea of Slotkin talking about Democrats being weak and woke, and
Yeah.
I think it's a super dangerous for your inspiring speeches to be written uh, by public relations people who think alliteration is the cool way to connect with people, right? So weak and woke, right? It just makes it sound staged, first of
Yeah.
all. But secondly, why are we defining ourselves? And by ourselves, I mean anybody who isn't a crazy right wing MAGA,
Yeah.
whatever, by using their terms. Why are we calling ourselves these things? Why are we calling ourselves weak? Because here's what I kind of thought of as woke before you informed me as to what it was. It seemed to me that it basically meant you were aware of the fact that there's racism in this country and you want to do
Well,
something
that's what it
about it,
started
right?
off as. Yeah.
And the fact that somebody uses the term woke and somebody else understands that term to be something like we stand up against racism seems to me that you are not communicating clearly and you are not controlling the narrative. What you are doing is you are using their words to define your actions. This is made even more fun by David Hogue. And again, I don't know. If I have his name pronounced correctly, right? He's the vice Democratic chairman, or
Yeah.
he's high up in the Democratic authority, and wanted to spend lots of money on primary challengers to Democratic races, right? So you've got all these Democrats who are in Congress, and he wants to fund all of the people who are also Democrats who want to say bad things about those Democrats. Now, I'm all for political competition, but what is going on when your own party is using their definition of words and their way of defining you, and you're like, yeah, let's use the way they're defining us and try and be more like them, and at the same time you're saying, and we're going to put money to people who stand up against those democratic rights that people appreciate. How are you making anything stronger? This does not seem to me to be an effective way to control the narrative and define your voice against the
Yeah.
conservatives. And I cut you off a minute ago, so I'm going to shut up now and let you chat.
The problem is that they don't have a narrative. So what they're trying to do, the narrative of the opposing party, because they don't have a narrative. There is no narrative. Go ahead.
You know who has a narrative?
Yeah, Trump.
Pete Buttigieg.
Oh, Pete Buttigieg does. Yes, he does.
Have you listened to
Oh
him?
my God! Did you listen to him in the podcast with this guy with that comedian? What's his name? Oh,
I don't know.
I'll send it
the guy
to
with
you.
the mustache.
Yeah, the guy with the mustache. I'll send you the whole
Yeah, it
thing.
looks like 70.
And you didn't have a message of something that you cared about that was loud enough to refute that.
Or again, controversial enough to get people as excited. Because our
I don't
message
even
in a
know.
way is
What did you care about?
I want everyday life to be better.
That's what they want too.
You get up in the morning, yeah, but importantly, like all the controversies are over what that's like. Like I want you to be able to get up in the morning, and the first thing you do is you commute to work, and by the way, if you're on an EV, I want that to be affordable for you, or if you're on public transit, not to get back into the subway situation, but I want you to have good public transit to get to where you're going, and then when you get to that job, I want you to be paid well, and if you're about to have a kid, I want you to know that you're going to have parental leave when you have that kid, and if you don't want to have a kid, I want you to have the right to choose whether to have a kid, which means access to birth control and abortion, and those things that give you the freedom to decide on that, and if you already have a kid, when you pick them up at school, I want that school to be good, not having its funding slashed while they set fire to the Department of Education. And then when you get home, I want you to be in a neighborhood that is safe and where you can breathe the air because we didn't let them get rid of the Clean Air Act. And you don't have to think for one moment about whether the air you breathe or the water you drink is clean and clear, which actually takes a lot because it means the government has to constrain those actors that would make you unfree by polluting the air and polluting the water. And then when you go to bed, I want you to know that your family's going to be fine, even if it's family like mine, despite there being some Supreme Court justice who wants to obliterate your family because it doesn't match his interpretation of his religion. Like that's the life I want everybody to be able to live.
Yeah, I think we can deliver that.
Cut that. That's
Yeah, that's
promo.
fine.
That's your promo for when you
Listen.
Run
I liked hearing that. I thought it was awesome. I thought it was beautiful.
So, man, that guy's got it together.
But
he really does have a message. He really does have a narrative. He really does have a plan. Right.
And you see how he builds that brand, right?
He is former military intelligence. He is the embodiment of somebody who is a patriot, who's a patriot, like a real patriot.
Midwest. I mean, what more could you want? I think AOC has a maturing voice, and I have a lot of time for some of the things that she says, but I don't think she's ready for the White House. And I think she plays an important role right where she is, but I can't see an AOC burning.
She's an agent of change. She's an agent of change, but certainly not. Her vibe is just not gonna. There are things.
Well, she's too young. She just is, and she's inexperienced. And I think that her place has to be out making a lot of noise, and rather than trying to stand. For president, right? So I think she just has to play the role that she plays, and I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
But that's the thing. Like they have to coordinate, and here's the you can say whatever you want to say about the Republican Party. When they get a talking point, they send a memo to everybody. The words of the talking point come out of everyone's mouth.
Everybody's mouth.
Like the messaging in that party is unreal, and they really control the narrative. right? So the economy is going south. He's going to keep doing what he's doing. He got on the news yesterday and said, well, maybe your kid will get $2 instead of $30, and maybe they'll cost more. That's just the way it's going to be, right?
Yeah, which means that that's massive inflation, by
Yeah.
the way. Just if anybody does the numbers on that, but
Oh, so but he said that, and now they're all going to say that. And now when it
yeah.
happens, what his followers will say is, see, that's what he said would happen. And it's Biden's fault. Because that's also what he said.
Oh, so let's do a quick. I did want to talk about. So there was a third topic that I wanted to go over today quickly, and that is GDP results. You probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about.
I spend about this much time thinking about the GDP
Yeah, so
results.
that's a big zero for those of you who are only listening. So this was that there are certain things that I understand are not particularly interesting to people. Things like economic numbers and charts with economic numbers. But this was a fascinating GDP result. This has got to be the most interesting GDP result that
Now I'm
I've ever seen.
fascinated.
So here's the breakdown. So do you remember what happened with the GDP? What we said with the GDP results for the first quarter?
Yeah, we're in like contracting.
So
we're
the economy is shrinking. We went from that really awful, terrible Biden economy of 2.5% to 3% real growth, and have now come to a negative 3%, right? Which means that the economy is shrinking, and that's like the headline. That's cool. That explains things, and it's also worth pointing out that these are preliminary results. They're always going to change. People get excited when these things change, but they do, I think, 2 more revisions over time, and they're going to be different. And that's just the way these things are, because gathering this information is tough. But this is kind of the headline results, right? Negative 3%, negative 0.3, negative 0.3%,
0.3
decline in gross domestic product, which is the output of the United States, the nation as a whole, not the nation, the country as a whole. So there's also this thing called gross national product, which is by Americans, no matter where they are in the world. And so this is gross domestic product, which is production within the United States.
Yeah, within our borders.
This is the headline, okay? What's interesting about the headline is actually what behind it. So this is a chart that I took from the New York Times. We have the positive things on the top of the chart. So anything that's growing or improving is above the line, and anything that's subtracted is below the line. So if something contracts or goes in a direction that takes away from gross domestic product, then it goes below the line, and anything that adds goes above the line. So we've had pretty much additions, some interesting. Back in 2023, there was a moment of contracting inventories. We had a trade spike in 22, but nothing really that compares to what we see in the first quarter of 2025, which is very interesting because, first of all, this idea of it's all Biden's fault, but you can see how things have transformed. Normally, you don't see these things so quickly.
Yeah,
it takes
clearly,
time.
forget about
so
quickly.
Clear. And what's also interesting about this is this underlying factor, because the net result is a negative 0.3, but that comes after you subtract imports. So there was a massive spike in imports in the first quarter of the year. We also saw a dramatic increase in inventory buildup in the first quarter of the year. So you'll hear the Republicans going around saying, well, there was this massive increase in investment. Investment is up. And it's true. There was an increase in investment, an increase in investment in inventory.
Particularly.
Inventory purchased from abroad and purchase from abroad now because everybody is very concerned about the fact that prices are going up, and probably temporarily, so they don't want to be stuck having to buy inventory later. So it ends up being a very interesting chart. And the thing to take away from this is, yeah, okay, there was a negative 3%, negative 0.3% contraction of the economy. There was some underlying health. So spending and investment wasn't actually terrible. Spending and investment was pretty much in line with what we'd expect. And there was this increase in inventories, which suggests buying to fill inventory, that was countered by this massive spike in trade. And there can be no doubt that the reason there was a massive spike in trade was everybody trying to get everything in before the
stocking
tariffs
up.
hit, right? So this is 100% a Trump quarter, and not necessarily as bad as some people would make it out to be, but at the same time, it's clear what's going on here, that we have this move towards hoarding inventory because we're concerned about trade. There's a lot of uncertainty built into these numbers. There's a lot of concern about what's going to happen built into these numbers. And I think it tells one of the more interesting stories I've ever seen in economic charts.
Absolutely.
Because it really shows what's going on. So, for all of those of you who have not been interested in economic charts in the past, hopefully this really,
Well,
piques your interest.
Here's the thing that I think about when we want to have this conversation, right? Because the impact of everything that's happening now is going to impact the next 3-4 decades, maybe the next century. You're starting to see, like, it couldn't get any clearer on that chart, like what's happening.
Yeah.
And if you're going to engage in an isolationist, unstable regime lunacy, I don't even know what to call it. I don't
whatever it's called.
I don't know what to call it if you're going to engage in that. And the parties think like, oh, in 4 years we'll fix this. No such luck. Not when you're making these kinds of moves. These kinds of moves will have shock waves that will last for the next few decades, is my prediction. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I think
these results are actually remarkable for how quickly they've happened. Normally there is sort of this hangover,
delay, yeah,
and
delay, yeah.
And as much as they like to blame Biden, they really have managed to take an economy that was growing at a pretty reasonable clip and turn it into an economy that is contracting, which is remarkable, right? I mean, that's pretty quick. I do think there is the other point around things taking time, and there are some structural things that we've built up over time that we're destroying, that will be decades. If we really move people away from the dollar, if we really set up isolationist policies, if we go back on all of our trade agreements, it's going to take a long time for people to start trusting the U.S. again. There will have to be some serious changes.
Yeah.
Which is a good segue into the main conversation that I actually wanted to have today, Joe, which is getting into game theory and how this connects to politics and some of what it suggests about the American system, and looking at it really from a power perspective, what we could potentially do. So I really want to start this with John Nash. So for those of you who don't know, do you know John Nash, Joe? Have you heard of John Nash?
The game theory guy.
Game theory guy. Yeah, it's really worth actually watching the movie. A Beautiful Mind is a movie about.
Oh
John
yeah,
Nash.
I saw that's him.
Yeah.
So then I saw that
that's
movie.
him.
He's
That's that guy,
freaking
right?
amazing, that guy. Yeah.
And so there is this scene in the movie, and this is actually how it happened. Sometime in the 40s, Nash was at a bar in Princeton, and he was observing these social dynamics, and he noticed that all these men were competing for the attention of one woman in a group of women. And he really noticed the power that gave that particular woman, and also noticed the fact that how, all these men were sort of competing with one another. And so as a result, none of them had any chance with anybody. They were going to remain in this constant competition. So he had this insight around coordinating their approach and going after different women to find a partner, and came up with this whole theory around non-cooperative games, where people make decisions independently, but reach a stable outcome where no player wants to change their strategy. So that's sort of the body of his work, and it came to be known as the Nash equilibrium. So it's one of the most important ideas in game theory. And it just describes the situation where, given what everybody else is doing, no player can improve their outcome by only changing their strategy, even when that equilibrium is not in the best interests of all of the players. And one of the most famous examples of this is the prisoner's dilemma. So here's the idea. So I'm going to take you through the concept of the prisoner's dilemma. And this here is a game board. This is sort of a traditional Nash equilibrium game board, and we have two players. And I stood up all night last night trying to figure out their names, and really came up with some that I think are going to stick with people.
I know I'm gonna love it. I love it.
We're gonna call the first one A. So A, and then the second one.
I'm gonna guess. I think we're gonna call him B.
No, of course not. Come on, we got to have a little bit of creativity in here. We'll call him Bartholomew.
Oh, there you go.
But we're just going to
B for
do B for short. So we've got A and Bartholomew, and they were out, and they went and they robbed a bank. Okay, so this is the idea. They went and they robbed a bank, and they have, and you know how in police dramas they go and they rob a bank. What do they always do? I mean, when the police arrest you,
put them in separate rooms and start interrogating
put them in separate
them.
rooms and they ask some questions about the other one, right?
Interrogation.
And this comes directly out of this work. And the idea is that you have these two people, they did it. They know they did it. Everybody knows they did it, but you don't really have enough evidence to charge them completely. Maybe you have them on enough evidence to give them a parking violation, but not enough for the bank heist, right? So you put them in separate rooms and you set up a situation in which they are competing with each other, and each one of them has a choice, right? So they can either remain silent, all right? So we can call that silent, or not talking, or they can talk. Now, here's the thing. If they both stay silent, then they end up with that draconian parking issue, and they each get a year in jail. But then the police make an offer to A. They say, if you talk and B doesn't talk, you get 0, and B gets 5. And they make the same offer to B. They say, if you don't talk and A talks, you get 0, and A gets 5. And then if you both talk, you both get 3, because now there's like this shared guilt. So you can see that A has an incentive to talk, because if they talk, then they go from 1 to 0. And if B talks, they go from 1 to 0. So both of them have an incentive to talk. And because of this, they will both talk. And that means that the Nash equilibrium is here in this quadrant, where they both end up with 3 years. And that's the point. The optimum solution is for them to stay silent, but the police create an incentive for them to talk. And that incentive drives them both to talk, which drives to this Nash equilibrium situation. Even though that isn't the optimal solution for both parties. There is a better solution. They're better off staying silent,
All day, every day.
but they're going to talk. And that is the point of the prisoner's dilemma, is that it drives you to this action that may not be the best action, but it is the equilibrium point. Now, the way out of this is to have a mob boss. Okay. So the way organized crime works is that the mob boss comes in and says, "Hey, I'll tell you what, if you talk, I'm going to kill you. It doesn't matter what the police say. You're just going to be dead."
Yeah. There's
So
no jail can save you.
no jail can save you. So you're just going to have to keep your mouth shut. So as a result, it forces everybody into this silent situation where they all have to be quiet because there's this outside force that's exerting control. So then you get into all these other things. Well, what if we give you, witness protection and blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, right? But
Yeah.
it's that external force that is keeping them in place. And this is an important thing to remember as we look at how this applies to politics. So the next thing to think about is that we have A and B, and these are again A and Bartholomew, but instead of criminals, they are voters, and they favor a third party candidate rather than the Democrat or the Republican. We face a similar dilemma when it comes to third parties. If A is a Democrat and B is a Republican, they may both prefer a third party candidate. But they also both know that there's no second place, that only the one with the most votes wins, and the Republicans and Democrats are almost certainly going to get more votes than the third party. So even though they might both prefer it, and we could say that A and B, if they both vote for the third party, then the third party wins. They also know, the Republican knows, that if they vote for the third party and the Democrat votes for the Democrats, well, then the Democrat's going to win. And the Democrat knows that if they vote for the third party and the Republican votes for the Republican, then the Republican wins. So this creates that stable but suboptimal equilibrium where everyone votes for traditional parties, even when everybody agrees a better alternative might exist. So the system mathematically prevents third parties from gaining traction regardless of their merits. Now, we can even take this a step further and look at this from a political party standpoint, because it also impacts the politicians, their campaigns, and their policies. So again, like prisoners in a dilemma, both Democrats and Republicans face a choice. They can campaign or govern constructively, or they can go destructively, right? So they can promote ideas or they can attack the other side. Now, constructive arguments are tough. They're dangerous. They require you to take a stance. And it's always easy to find a problem with somebody taking a stance. There's always something a little bit wrong. They want to build a bridge, but it's the wrong color. You can always find something. And it's easier to stoke outrage about what somebody is doing versus what's not happening. So we may prefer both sides to be constructive, because if they're both constructive, then they win on the merits. Whoever has the best program or the best idea wins. But the problem is that if the Democrat stays constructive and the Republican goes destructive, then the Republican wins, because this is the more engaging argument. And the other way here, right? Which means that they both have an incentive to go destructive. They're both going to go in this direction, which means that we end up with both Democrats and Republicans in the destructive camp. And this brings us to winning based on resources, and I would say winning based on consistency of message. So That's one area where the Republicans have demonstrated a clear strength, is in using their resources to have that very clear destructive message that people can relate to. They also get the money, and that puts them in the situation of winning in this construct. So now we have, again, that suboptimal Nash equilibrium around winning based on resources rather than winning based on merits. And it's important here to realize that neither party has to win. They just have to not lose, because there isn't a third opportunity. There isn't another option. And this reminds me of a joke. I learned this joke in South Africa, right? I was on a safari drinking gin and tonics behind a truck, and the guide pointed out lions on the ridge. And I asked if it was dangerous, that we're out here with lions. And he said, well, I've got good shoes on. And you? And I said, well, wait, can we really outrun lions? And he said, no, of course not. But I just have to outrun
How about
you.
you? That's it.
And which is a well-known joke, right? But I didn't know it at the time, and I thought that was particularly funny. And then I got in the truck. But that's exactly what the political system is built towards, right? When it's win-lose, candidates don't need good ideas. They just need to be a little bit less worse than their opponent. They have to not lose. They have to not be eaten by the lion. So that brings both parties back to this destructive situation that results in political discourse focused on tearing down the opposition rather than building up solutions. So the side with the most resources to invest in destructive messaging wins. But if you add a viable third party, then this changes, because they're like somebody sitting back on the truck with their feet up watching the drama unfold, right? They don't have to participate in the destructive race to the bottom. So that would kind of force the other two parties to stop running around and come up with ideas. And this is also important, it also gives place for stupid ideas. So there should always be stupid ideas out there. There should always be people talking about things that are blatantly wrong, that aren't going to work. Like, that's actually
we're
okay.
going to the moon. You need crazy ideas.
But I mean, even things that you hate, because it's when you tell them that they can't talk that they get the most power. If you've got one idiot out there on the street corner saying, hey, white supremacy, and everybody's looking at him like that's an idiot, well, that just strengthens the fact that that person's an idiot. But when they can't talk, then that makes their position stronger. So sometimes you actually even want these crazy idea parties, because they stay really tiny and people see how tiny they are, and that really limits their voice. So there is a real argument for saying we want stupid ideas. Now, what this shows, though, is that there's this incentive towards destructive positioning. But really, over the, I'm not going to say 100 years, but if we look at the time period from the late 1930s until the 90s, we had a different situation. So during World War II, we had this common enemy, and the common enemy were the Nazis in Japan. And that external threat really unified Americans and created an overwhelming incentive to work together for the national good.
Yes.
And so the result of that was this unprecedented industrial output. We got out of the Great Depression. We had scientific advancement. We had victory. And then after World War II, the Soviet Union became our common enemy. And this again forced us into cooperation. We had National Defense Act. We had DARPA, which then created the internet. We had the interstate highway system. We had technology investments. We got to the moon, right? We did amazing things in that period of time. And we were all very unified around, we had a
common enemy.
We had a common enemy. And it worked like that mob boss to force us into that constructive space. Because essentially what it said was, hey, if you go destructive, the Russians are going to win.
Yeah,
and that's much worse.
I always tell my friends, you know what we need? We need an alien invasion.
Could you imagine if we had an alien invasion?
Oh my goodness!
Unite
the whole planet. The whole planet would get behind it like immediately, right away. Everybody would be like, "Oh crap!" It's not just us.
But what we've done is gone the other way. So we lost in the 90s, we lost our mob boss, and that was the
Yeah.
common enemy that
Yeah, but
forced
see, the
cooperation.
the human animal is designed to have that mob boss. So when the mob boss doesn't
Well,
exist, then
but I'm
you
gonna,
turn
I
you
disagree
turn
with you.
somebody else into the opposition.
It's not human beings that are built that way. That is the point of my conversation.
Oh,
It is the
interesting.
system
That is
that
built
is
that way.
structured that way.
Ah, interesting.
So you are seeing it as the human beings, but it is not human beings. It is this system. So the point of this game theory conversation is that we have constructed a system that forces us to have that conversation, that requires us to have the mob boss. We're like the criminals in the prison system. Now, you could have a situation which you bring the people together in the prison system. It would be a very different dynamic. But we don't have that. And we don't have that in our system. So we have to have the mob boss that keeps us in a constructive environment.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that since the early 90s, there's a lot of research that shows this increasing polarization. So from 1994 to 2014, the share of Americans holding consistently liberal or consistently conservative views doubled from 10 to 21%. That's from Pew Research. The average Republican in 2014 was more conservative than 94% of Democrats, compared to 70% of Democrats in 94. Similarly, the average Democrat was more liberal than 92% of Republicans, up from 64% in 1994. And among voters, the ideological moderates have declined. So, that's gone down to the 34% identifying as moderate in 2025. And conservatives and liberals have grown in their respective parties. And studies show that since the 90s, Democratic voters have shifted more to the left than Republicans have shifted to the right. But Republican elected officials have moved more sharply to the right than Democrats have moved to the left. So the rhetoric has moved even further towards the right. And one of the reasons for that has been this consistency that we talked about in terms of the narrative within the Republican Party and the Republican Party bosses. Again, that mob boss concept reinforcing the standardization of the messaging on the Republican side.
And man, they are good with messaging.
And they are good with messaging. So that leaves us in this situation where we have a system where either we need a new mob boss, right? We need that common enemy that forces us to work together despite our differences, or we need to change the structure of the system to allow third parties and even voices that we really don't agree with and that we hate to thrive. Okay. And the first option really depends on external circumstances, and we can't do that. We have to have an alien invasion, or it forces us into this constant war 1984 type of situation. The second one is completely within our control. And there are things that we can do within our political system now that would allow us to create incentives to have third parties, or would allow us to create incentives to vote for third parties, or at least remove the incentive to not vote for third parties.
Yeah.
And that would completely change the conversation. So it would take the power away from the bosses controlling the parties and give it more towards the voters. So I want to leave it there for this episode. And in the next episode, we're going to talk about what some of those options
How do we get out of it?
could be.
So we'll talk about it next episode.
So as always, if you have any comments or anything to add to the conversation, we welcome your comments. We would love to hear from you. And otherwise, next time we will talk about how we break this system, what some of the options are, and And next time, we will talk about what some of the options might be to break the system right here on Masters of Influence.
That's it for this episode of Masters of Influence. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who wants to understand power. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and keep mastering the game.